The first sign wasn't obvious. There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, no signs of forced entry. The house looked exactly the way it had been left, clean, quiet, and undisturbed. But something about it felt wrong. It was subtle. A shift in placement. A detail slightly out of alignment. The kind of change that could easily be dismissed, unless it happened in a place where nothing should have changed at all. The living room carried that feeling first. Objects that had been arranged with precision now sat just slightly off. A chair angled differently.
According to my inspection, your fence is 6 inches too high, and your petunias are the wrong shade of purple.
Controlled.
This is your formal
Deliberate.
warning.
That was what made it unsettling. The deeper the house was examined, the more that feeling grew. It wasn't random disturbance. It was movement with purpose. Someone had been there. Not searching, not rushing, but observing. The realization didn't come all at once. It built gradually, each detail confirming what the last suggested. Someone had entered the house, while no one was there. And they had done it without leaving a trace strong enough to immediately expose them. That was the part that mattered most. Because it meant they weren't afraid. Whoever had done this believed they had the right. The HOA had always been present. At first, it had been manageable. A structured system designed to maintain order, protect property values, and ensure consistency across the neighborhood. But over time, that structure had shifted. The rules became stricter. The enforcement became more frequent. What had once been guidance slowly turned into control. Not obvious control, but persistent. There were notices about minor details, things that didn't seem worth attention. A shade variation. A landscaping adjustment. Small issues that required correction, even when they caused no real disruption. The house had never been out of compliance. But it had never fully aligned with the HOA's evolving expectations either. That difference mattered. Because in a system built on uniformity, anything that stands slightly apart becomes a point of focus. The tension didn't rise all at once. It developed quietly, reinforced through repeated interactions. Requests that felt less like suggestions and more like instructions. Inspections that seemed more frequent than necessary. The boundary between oversight and intrusion began to blur. But even then, there was an assumption. That certain lines wouldn't be crossed. That no matter how strict the HOA became, private property, especially the interior of a home, would remain untouched. That assumption no longer held. The emotional weight didn't come from what was taken. Because nothing was missing. It came from what had been violated. The idea that someone had entered the house without permission carried a different kind of impact. It wasn't about loss. It was about presence. An unseen presence. The kind that lingers even after the space is empty again. That realization changed the way the house felt. Familiar spaces no longer carried the same sense of control. Every room held the possibility of having been observed. Every object became a reminder that privacy had been interrupted. The reaction wasn't immediate anger. It was focus. A need to understand. Because actions like this don't happen randomly. They are justified, at least by the people who carry them out. There is always a reason, a policy, a belief that supports the decision. Finding that justification became the priority. Because once it was found, it could be challenged. And the deeper the situation was examined, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Patterns began to emerge. Inspections that had gone beyond what was documented. Reports that referenced details that could only be observed from inside the property. Subtle inconsistencies that, when viewed together, formed something much larger. Something systemic. The moment the situation moved beyond private awareness, everything shifted. What had been a personal violation became a public concern. Because the implications extended beyond one house. If access had been taken once, it could be taken again. Not just here, but anywhere within the HOA's reach. That realization changed how others viewed the situation. Attention grew. Questions followed. And with questions came pressure. The HOA's authority had always relied on structure, rules, procedures, and the assumption that those rules were being followed. But once that assumption was challenged, the structure began to weaken. The issue wasn't just raised. It was examined. Documents were reviewed. Policies were questioned. The justification for inspections was analyzed more closely than it had ever been before. And within that analysis, something became clear. The authority the HOA claimed didn't extend as far as their actions had. That gap created tension. Because once authority is shown to exceed its limits, it demands accountability. The truth didn't come from a single discovery. It came from connection. Records that seemed unrelated began to align. Inspection logs matched dates when homeowners were away. Reports included details that couldn't have been observed externally. Internal communications hinted at practices that weren't publicly acknowledged. This wasn't accidental overreach. It was method. The HOA had developed a system of entry, quiet, controlled, and justified internally under loosely interpreted rules. Maintenance checks, safety inspections, compliance verification, all framed in a way that allowed access. Without direct permission. That was the violation. Not just entry, but systematic intrusion. And once that pattern was clear, the situation transformed completely. Because it wasn't about a single incident anymore. It was about a practice. The resolution didn't come from confrontation. It came from exposure. Every detail that had been uncovered, every inconsistency, every pattern, every overreach, was brought together into a single, undeniable structure. One that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding or error. The response was measured, precise, and supported by evidence that extended beyond one homeowner. The outcome followed naturally. The HOA, once confident in its authority, was forced to operate within the limits it had ignored. Policies were re-evaluated. Practices were discontinued. Oversight replaced assumption. And accountability took the place of control. The house returned to what it had been. But it didn't feel the same. Because something had changed. Not just within the space, but within the system that surrounded it. The line that had been crossed was now visible. And once a line becomes visible, it becomes harder to cross again. The impact extended beyond one situation. It redefined expectations. Reminded everyone involved that authority has limits. And that those limits matter. Because without them, control replaces trust. And once trust is gone, everything else begins to fall apart.